Before we get started today, we wanted to take some time to acknowledge, with respect, the Indigenous peoples and communities whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day, and on whose traditional territories our work takes place. So we acknowledge a debt to those here before us and recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationships Indigenous people have within this land. So with that, hi, my name is Yusra, and I am a research assistant with Peach Health Ontario. So on behalf of Peach Health Ontario, the Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare and Good Investing, we would like to welcome you to today's webinar named Climate Proofing Your Finances. So just a couple quick notes. Throughout the webinar, we have two different chat functions. So we have the regular chat function and we have a Q&A function. And we just wanted to real quick explain the differentiation between the two. So throughout the webinar, please use the chat function for any technical issues you may be experiencing. I'll hop on and try to support you if anything like that comes up. If you have any Q&As that you would like to have answered at the end of the seminar by Tim or Courtney, please use the Q&A function. And the panelists will answer those questions at the end of the webinar. And with that, we have our panelists here today who you might have heard chatting a little bit right before this. So we are here today with Tim and Dr. Courtney Howard. I'll let them do their intros later on as well, too. I can just give a quick brief one as well. So Tim is the founder of Good Investing, and he's helped more than 10,000 people put their money where their values are. So he's a certified financial planner, a passionate teacher. He's more than just a financial expert. He's a coach who guides you every step of your financial journey from life's big transitions to the finer details. He's a trust authority on sustainable and impactful investing, and he's been featured on CBC, BNN Bloomberg, and Globe and Mail. Dr. Courtney Howard is an emergency physician in Yellowknives Dean Territory and a clinical associate professor at the University of Calgary. She's a leading voice in planetary health and has shaped policy on climate-related health risks, eco-anxiety, and sustainable health systems. Former president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, she has advised the Lancet and the Global Climate and Health Alliance. She's now focused on well-being centered economics, and she's the chair of the Global Climate and Health Alliance and president of the Northern Western Territories Medical Association. She also has two young daughters, and she loves to dance. So that brings me to the end of my little spiel. I'm going to give it to Tim to get us started. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Tim, take it away.
Thank you so much, Yusra. Really, really appreciate this opportunity. Welcome, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to get into my presentation here. How does that look? Can someone give me in the chat, Yusra, a thumbs up? Okay, great. Fantastic. Yeah. Welcome to Climate Proving Your Personal Finances. Really, really excited for y'all to join us. I'm going to give a little presentation, probably in the ballpark, maybe like 20 minutes, is sort of what I'm aiming for. And then we'll get into a really good conversation with Dr. Courtney Howard. But just really wanted to welcome everyone. I'm coming to you from Toronto, which is Treaty 13 territory, home of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. I would love to know where people are coming from. If you can put in the chat just where you are. I would love to see it. I just love knowing kind of where people are. Always nice to know kind of who's in the crowd. My mission is to help 1 million Canadians invest intentionally. So this is something that I've been doing for, I think, about 15, maybe even 17 years by now. I think I've helped over 10,000 people like directly. I've reached probably closer to 50,000 people through kind of various channels and different teachings that I've done. And that really, you know, my mission is really helping people figure out their personal finances and to figure out these things in a way that absolutely aligns with your values. And I don't really care what people's values are. We all have a different idea of good and evil and what that means to you. But to me, it's really about helping you understand whatever your mission is, whatever your values are, how can we align your investments and your money with that vision that you are trying to achieve. So the first thing I'm going to start off, I have sort of a couple little topics that we're going to go through. The first thing I want to talk about is this idea of banks versus credit unions. I do have a much longer sort of lecture on this. I'll throw it into the chat here. So you can, this is a YouTube video I've done, a lecture in the past that goes into like greater detail on banks versus credit unions. So you can absolutely sort of open that up in a tab and keeping it there. I love seeing where everyone is coming from. I will point out that a couple people, if it says :2 in the chat, sometimes it defaults to hosts and panelists. And if you just want to switch that to everyone, that way everyone can see the messages there. But, would love to know how many people, I don't know how many people in the audience are already with a credit union, but if you're already with a credit union, let me know. I'd love to know what credit union you're with. The reason people are switching, and this is kind of like step one when it comes to climate proofing your personal finances, is that the Canadian banks are just some of the biggest financiers of fossil fuels in the world. We know this. If you're not aware of this, I would really point you towards this report, Banking on Climate Chaos, that they publish every year. And that, you can see here the big 5 banks here: RBC, Scotiabank, TD, BMO, and CIBC. This is their global ranking. So all 5 banks rank really high up globally. We can see what their financing of fossil fuels were in 2023, but the total sort of cumulative emissions between 2016 and 2023, is just massive. Like RBC, $256 billion in fossil fuels over that period of time. And it really is, again, I just want to underscore this, that, most of us, when we set up our banks, we just like get the bank that whatever bank our parents banked with, or if you came to Canada as an immigrant, it was like, just kind of whatever advertisements you saw. So many of us are kind of with the big bank just by default. And really the action step number one, if you want to sort of decarbonize your personal finance, if you want to reduce your exposure for both ethical reasons and financial reasons, step number one is to join a credit union. Credit unions are amazing. I'll talk about them in a minute, but here's really why. So Project Drawdown is an incredible organization. This is, I don't know if people have heard of Project Drawdown. Let me know in the chat if you've heard of them before, but this is a really cool initiative by Paul Hawken and a number of amazing climate experts. And they did this project called Saving for the Planet, the Climate Power of Personal Banking. And what they showed is that for every $1,000, now this is USD, so for every $1,000 a person has in savings is roughly equivalent to the direct emissions generated by flying from New York to Seattle every year. Every year. Now, most of us have more than $1,000 in our checking and savings accounts, right? And so this is a chart that they did, and this is, in terms of different actions that we can take. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't like an either or, this is a yes and. I absolutely want you to, fly less, and I want you to adopt a vegetarian or a vegan diet. I want you to switch to an electric vehicle and put solar panels on your roof. Like, we can do all of these things. But if you're doing all of these things and you haven't moved your money, you're still banking with a traditional bank, this could be one of the biggest contributors to your personal carbon footprint. That if moving 8K from a carbon intensive bank to a climate responsible bank is massive. It's about 1.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Most of us have even more. Like when I work with clients, 8K is usually what we keep like as a float in our checking accounts. Like for my wife and I, that our personal finances are such that our monthly expenses are about $7,500 a month. And so we usually keep that in our checking account. But then I usually suggest people keep, 3 months to 6 months expenses in a savings account, that I really want you to have an emergency fund. But what this means is that, if we keep 8K in our checking account, we probably keep closer to like 25K in our savings account as an emergency fund. You can start to see how big this bar chart is going to get. So give a little thought to like, how much do you keep in your checking account? How much do you keep in your savings account? And realize that, oh my goodness, if you haven't switched to a climate responsible bank like a credit union, and these are US figures. Well, remember, the Canadian banks are really big financiers of fossil fuels. It might be actually even be bigger than this, because we're here in Canada, where the banks do invest so much in fossil fuels. So it really is, step one is like, join a credit union. There are like, Courtney, I know you're in the Northwest Territories, so there aren't a lot of credit unions in the territories, but I did find First Nations Bank of Canada, which is a really, really cool bank there that, it's not technically a credit union. But I want to be clear, like switching to a credit union, this is a really simple action. Um, the credit unions offer all the same services as a bank. There's still like an app, so I can take a photo of a check and deposit a check, with my phone. I really don't have to go into a branch very often. So, certainly if you do want to, you find a credit union with a branch near you, that's great. But you're not limited to that. You can really join any credit union. And I will say they are governed provincially, such that, when you are a resident, for me, I'm a resident of Ontario. So I really only have the Ontario credit unions available for me. But just would really, really encourage people to this as like a first step. I can see, a lot of folks here have joined with Meridian, but still doing some work with the big banks. That's Miles. Linda says Northern Birch and First Ontario Credit Union. User says CIBC. So user, this is like something that maybe, we might want to consider shifting. Denise is in Treaty 6, Edmonton, in the process of moving to service credit unions after 40 years with the Royal Bank. So, if people, and this is a lot easier than people realize. And I just want to point out like how hard it is and how many trade-offs there are. Like, I try to avoid flying, but sometimes I need to, like someone's getting married or, there's something in an event or conference I really need to go. It's hard, changing your diet, can make some progress, but it's challenging. Not everyone has a charging station or, if you rent, you probably don't want to put solar panels up on your home, but this is something that everyone can do. You only have to do it once. There are no trade-offs. Typically, fees are even lower than with a bank, right? So this really is a very, very simple movement. Miles, I will suggest if you want to, in the chat, right now you've got it to hosts and panelists. If you just want to switch in your chat and just type to everyone, because you're asking, has anyone tried to start a movement to encourage people to make the switch? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Project Drawdown, there are a number of different organizations. I can show you a couple resources, but this is a lesson, that I've got. I have a classroom. I'll just throw the link in the chat. But this is where, I put a lot of my lessons. I've got like a whole mini course on this, how to fire your bank and join a credit union. Lots and lots of different organizations have encouraged this. And I got to say, like, it's really easy for those who have made the switch. It's pretty straightforward way to be able to reduce your carbon footprint. So that's kind of step one. Step two is now about sustainable investing. So that's looking at your checking and your savings accounts. When it comes to your investments, again, I do have, much more information. I'm going to try to keep it super high level right now. But really what I want to communicate is that a traditional investment portfolio, this is a very simple pie chart. This is what we call a balanced portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds. If you just kind of like have a very traditional balanced portfolio, this is what's going to be inside of it. This is, a mix of stocks and bonds. But when we start to dig deeper and understanding what evil lurks inside the global stock market, I did this from a climate perspective, and it's terrible. Like, there are terrible things inside the global stock market. So this is a great organization called As You Sow. I love using them for research. And I'm just looking at this again as like a globally diversified, stock standard portfolio is going to have exposure of almost 9% exposure to fossil fuels. So this is really, really high. Like, this is a high exposure to fossil fuels. We're going to have, owners of carbon reserves, so oil companies, gas companies that have proven reserves that might become stranded assets is something we could talk a little bit more about. If you want to look at it from a risk perspective, you're going to have coal companies, lots of oil and gas, refiners, pipelines, right? So if you're worried about that issue, they're going to be in there. You're going to have utilities, so utilities that burn coal, and you're going to have a lot of utilities that burn natural gas inside the portfolio. So this is just what is in there. If you haven't looked at what's inside, this is probably what is hiding out inside of your investment portfolio. And the bad news is that in Canada, it's even worse. that because for us, we tend to have what's called a home bias, where we do have a larger percentage of our assets in Canadian stocks, that I've just got here like this iShares MSCI Canada ETF, which is just kind of like the Canadian stock market. It's 24% in fossil fuels. So many of us by default have a huge percentage of our portfolio inside of fossil fuels. Colleen says we invest with RBC, but have a green filter, eliminates fossil fuel. How effective is that? You know, it's not bad. I've looked at the RBC Vision Fossil Fuel Free Fund. This is a fund I know really well. It does a pretty good job of eliminating fossil fuels, but mostly oil and gas and pipelines. There are still going to be some utilities in there that burn fossil fuels. But the problem with it is that it's a very narrow screen for just fossil fuels, Colleen. So this is my dig with the RBC one, is that they don't necessarily eliminate other things like weapons or for-profit prisons or other kind of like ethical considerations, which can be a little bit of a tricky. Wendy asks if some of us are close to retirement, does it make sense to switch our investments and switch to a credit union? Like, yeah, absolutely. You know, I can walk you through. Let me talk about switching investments in a minute, but switching to a credit union, yeah, absolutely. You know, it really has no bearing. You know, it might be a little bit tricky on the tech side. So, you know, depending how comfortable you are with the systems, and hopefully there's still a branch nearby. But yeah, this is something that anyone of any age can do. When it comes to a sustainable portfolio, you know, really what we want to do is just do the same thing, but a little bit different. What we'll do is most of your portfolio should be doing less evil, stocks and bonds, right? Very, very similar. And this is where, again, we want to get rid of things like fossil fuels and weapons and tobacco or whatever you consider to be evil. Everyone has a different definition. That's fine. But then what we can do is kind of carve out part of our portfolio for green stocks. And then we can carve out part of our portfolio for impact bonds. This is what I get really excited for, or crunchy granola, things like community bonds or, you know, microfinance. There's some really cool local impact investments. We don't want to put all of our money in those things. We really only want to carve out a small little piece of it. That really, when it comes to sustainable investing, the language that I use is sort of doing less evil versus doing more good. Under doing less evil, we're going to have things like ESG, which is environmental social governance, this idea of like sustainability scores. We have divestment, which is saying no, not one penny into things like oil and gas and fossil fuels. And then we do have shareholder engagement. And that, you know, if we've got shareholder engagement, you know, this is the idea of owning shares and then pushing the company in the right direction. So, you know, there's a little bit of a debate here between divestment versus shareholder engagement. You know, should I not own any shares, or is it better to own some shares and then sort of push the company? That's a difference in philosophy. ESG is kind of like a no-brainer. Everyone should be doing some degree of ESG analysis. This is becoming very, very mainstream in the financial industry, is having at least some ESG perspective. And all of these are doing less evil approaches are designed to earn the same returns. So you're going to earn exactly the same returns as you would otherwise, right? And then it's the doing more good where we might start to have a little bit of deviation. This is why I only want you to put a small part of your portfolio into these things. That under doing more good, we have thematic investing where we can invest in green themes like renewable energy, clean tech, water, right? There are things linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But again, these are less diversified. Some years they'll do better, some years they'll do worse, right? So we are sort of putting a bet on those themes. And then we do have impact investing, which I love so much. This is the piece that I get really, really passionate about with like the crunchy granola, you know, really like local. We're loaning money to nonprofits and to co-ops. I do have another link that I'll share for a YouTube video, which is how to start impact investing. You know, if y'all are really interested in that, that can be a really good place to be like, how do I approach this? How do I start? And again, I only want you to do it with a small part of your money. The analogy that I use is that when we build a portfolio, it's like baking a pie. Okay. The crust of the pie is like your bonds. This is safe. This is secure, right? That's providing the stability in your portfolio. But really, the reason we eat pies is the filling. So we want the filling. That's our stocks. That's really why we eat pie. That's like, you know, the biggest thing is now, of course, we're going to want to get rid of all the nasty ingredients, you know, so we can have sort of an organic pie here with that. But for some people, just stocks and bonds, that's really all you need, right? Just do the doing less evil stuff. And then the doing more good, the green investments, that's really kind of the whipped cream or the ice cream on the pie. You don't need ice cream on the pie, but a lot of us want some whipped cream. A lot of us want those exposure to those green sectors, right? But again, it's not the whole pie, it's just really the topping. And then the cherry on top are your impact investments, especially if you're just getting started. You don't need to do the impact investments, but if you are in a position where you've got more than enough money and you feel privileged and we feel comfortable that, having that cherry on top with community bonds or, really local grassroots thing, feeling that this is really, the cherry on top of the pie. And this is the piece that I get the most passionate about. So really, action item number 2 is just start asking questions. Just ask. Just ask questions. I want you to ask all types of things in terms of what's inside my portfolio. Like, what do I actually own? And not just like the fun names and not like, I want you to dig deeper that what are the companies that are actually inside of those funds to get a feel for does it align with your values? Right? And everyone's going to have different values, and that's totally normal and fine. But like, does it align with your values? And then while you're examining this, I do want you to ask, like, what fees am I paying? Someone mentioned that RBC fund. And I got to say, my biggest issue, my biggest, sort of frustration with that RBC fossil fuel free mutual fund is that it's kind of expensive, that it's got a really high, the acronym we use is MER, management expense ratio. And a lot of these companies, especially the banks, they do kind of try to rip you off for the sustainable options. It's like kind of when, with the organic food, like if you go and it's like the organic food is like a lot more expensive and is it really making a difference? They feel that they can kind of get away with that. Ooh, you want the ethical option? Okay, we're going to make you have higher fees. So, I really do, as you're going through this process, I do want you to examine the fees that you're paying. The clients that I work with, whether they shift to a DIY approach, so learn how to do it themselves, and that's the way to get your fees very, very low. That's how I save my clients boatloads of money in fees. But even if you switch to another advisor, 90% of the time, I'm actually able to lower your fees for you while making it more sustainable. So again, this is the really cool thing with climate proofing your portfolio is that, yeah, there are ethical reasons to do it. There are risk reasons to do it, that, things like climate risk and getting that out of your portfolio. But then oftentimes it's like people have never shopped around for this stuff. And that when you do start to look at other options, you realize, hey, I can actually save money in fees as well, which is just, an absolute bonus. If you do want to learn about how to switch advisors, so especially if you're approaching retirement, right? Or you are, thinking about switching advisors and either moving to a DIY approach or moving to a full service approach. I'll put this in the chat as well. I'm doing a webinar next week. So we're doing this next Tuesday, 7 p.m. Eastern. Daryl is a friend, colleague of mine. He works for a firm called Genesis Capital Management. They've got fossil fuel free funds. They manage money for the David Suzuki Foundation, as well as for Greenpeace Canada. They're a B Corp. So they really are top tier in terms of sustainable asset managers. So if you want someone to do it for you, then Daryl's a great guy. I can sort of meet him on this webinar. If you just register, we'll send you the video. So even if you can't make it next Tuesday, register for that, and then you can meet Daryl, and we can talk about the nuts and bolts of actually switching into sustainable investments and what to consider. And then my real focus is helping people who want to DIY, so who want to learn to do it themselves. This is where we can really customize and based on your definition of sustainability, and it is the lower fees. If you're interested in working with me or like learning more about it, I have a little form. You can request a free consultation with me. I'm happy to chat with absolutely anyone for about half an hour. So that's the link to a little form that fills out, and then my assistant will reach out to you in about a week or so, and we'll get you lined up with a free consultation. But really, what I want to leave you with is just understanding that the status quo is very carbon intensive. If you've never thought about this stuff, if you've never looked at it, if you're just like with a bank and you're just like invested in a traditional investment portfolio, there's a huge carbon impact in terms of where your money is currently sitting. Switching is simple. Like, it really is straightforward. I know it can feel scary, it can feel intimidating, it can feel intense, but it's not. And you only have to do it once. It's not like something you have to do every week or every month. Like, you really only have to do it once, and then you've done it. And there aren't major trade-offs, that you don't have to sacrifice financial returns. You don't have to pay higher fees. In fact, oftentimes we can lower your fees by switching into sustainable options. And the last thing is that, the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. That I think for a lot of people, this is something that they've thought about doing for a while or wish they had done, decades ago. But really, I'm here to tell you that, today's the day. Like the second best time to plant a tree is today. So really happy to get going. Ken says one trade-off is losing a 30-year relationship with the current advisor. Like, yeah, I hear that, at the same time, it's like, I'll just say that if you're getting good service, then, fantastic. If you've got a good advisor, great. Those relationships are valuable. A lot of people aren't. A lot of people aren't getting money. A lot of people don't have an advisor that aligns with their values. So, if you've got a good relationship, fantastic, thumbs up, good job, keep working with them. But I think a lot of us are not happy with the relationship and yet are kind of afraid to switch for a variety of reasons. So that's it for me. That's kind of my little once over. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And then, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim. That was an incredibly informative presentation. I've genuinely learned a lot. I know Courtney also mentioned craving pie after your analogy, and I can echo that. I'm also craving now.
Pie craving.
So with that, I guess we can give our participants some time to maybe start throwing questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom call, and then Miles can take it away with kind of speaking those out. I have one question that I can ask that's hopefully not going to be, well, a personal question, I guess. A lot of us are really worried about greenwashing, and so how do we get confidence about whether a fund is truly green or not?
Yeah, I mean, it really is looking at what's inside, right? And the thing is, everyone has a different definition of sort of what that means. So, to me, it's like first about understanding what are your expectations around this. And then recognizing that for every product, it's somewhere on a spectrum. There's a whole spectrum. And so at any one point in that spectrum, it's going to be too sustainable for some people, and it's going to be not sustainable enough for other people. So, to me, it really is a personal thing. And then it's about looking at what's inside and understanding, what are your priorities? And is this where you are on that spectrum? Like, do you want just a small step in the right direction? Or do you want like a crunchy granola thing? So it's just understanding that it is a really subjective thing. I know, Courtney, like we went through a process, like I'm trying to remember when it was that we worked together. That was like,
yeah, if I could jump in, I think it would be good to have Courtney do her piece. And boy, the crunchy granola is getting me hungry too. But Courtney, you go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean it's sort of fun to reminisce, really. I had just given birth to my daughter, who's now 13. So I think it was probably like 12 years ago or 13 years ago. And like many new moms, I had already been involved in climate related things. But that, I believe, was the summer. Yeah, it was the summer that Bill McKibben's article on the terrifying new math of climate change came out. And I actually remember reading it. And she was about 8 months old at the time. I finished it curled up around her in the fetal position, trying to get her to nap. And I was sort of like, I had my iPhone, which I probably shouldn't have been doing. And anyway, that was basically the start of our efforts to divest from fossil fuels as a family, and also to get the Canadian Medical Association to divest from fossil fuels, which was something that Tim, it was actually really key for me to do the work myself so I understood it properly. So then I could actually really answer questions in a detailed way. But, Tim, I've thought about it since, and I don't know what your process is now. At the time you sort of signed up with Tim, and it was quite a lot of hours, 8 hours or something like that. Yeah. And so like my husband and I sat here basically like talking. I've thought about it. That was the closest thing to marriage counseling we've ever done. I don't know if it's because you're like talking through, like, what are your goals for the future? What do you believe in? What compromises are you willing to make? And sometimes we would sit there like, really? And at other moments we were right on the same page. So in fact, it was a totally useful thing to do that we wouldn't have done. And as he said, you really have to go looking at what's in those, like, he would pull something up and it's like, it's got this and this and this and this. It's like looking at the ingredients on a box of cookies that you're buying from like the middle part of the grocery store where you're not supposed to shop. It looks good on the surface, great, nice picture. And then you're like, wait a second, like glucophosphorus, that's what all of these ETFs are like, or a lot of them, or the fossil fuel funds. And so, we did that process very, diligently. We ended up doing it ourselves. And so we sort of have different buckets. And as the world changes, we find something new in a bucket. And, that's worked well for us. And then I think it's really important to note, and people are putting in the chat there that, they're looking for advice. I have found that many people are simply not briefed. And, I've been doing work around climate change and health for about 15 years. And a big part of that has been getting this work into mainstream medical curricula. And it was just October that I led a roadmap for the implementation of what's called the Declaration of Planetary Health in Canada. The medical deans passed it in October of 2024.
Wow.
And since then, and that is done based on curriculum surveys that we've done in Canada, internationally, that have consistently shown that we're not teaching doctors about the biggest health emergency of our time. And since then, I've helped engineers do it in curricula across Canada. Will Gagnon did one. Yep, same thing. Engineers aren't being taught about that, so that's great in terms of the infrastructure we're building. And I went to Oxford, got really nerdy, and did a policy degree at the Blavatnik School of Government. And as part of that, ended up helping Kate Rayworth put on an 8-part lecture series. So she's the author of Donut Economics, and she did that as an act of what she called academic activism, because she's so frustrated that her school, like Oxford, it's the top university in the world. I think now it was 8 years, it might even be 9 years in a row. So the oldest university in the English speaking world, top university in the world. And there's good reasons for that, but man, they're simply not teaching the next generation of world leaders about systemic financial risk related to climate change. And I sidled up. You have access to people there. So sometimes we were drinking coffee, sometimes we were drinking wine. And I sidled up to people like Nobel Prize winners, professors of this or that, and I picked their brain. They were not, in many cases, taking this into account. And so when you think about that, so doctors aren't, the engineers aren't, the economists aren't, the people teaching, the world leaders aren't. We've got the unburnable carbon systemic risk is simply not priced into the market. And in Canada, we have some of basically the most labor intensive oil in the world to take out of the ground. Like Saudi Arabia can take oil out of the ground cheaply, basically until the end of time. We can't. And so what that means is as we transition, we're super vulnerable, because we can end up with people stopping investing here and just taking that money to where they can get a better return, where it doesn't cost so much, right? You don't have to refine the bitumen. You can just take like light sweet crude out of the ground. And it terrifies me really to look at the degree to which we're all investing in this industry, that when you look at any academic analysis of which oil is going to get left in the ground first, it's ours. Like we come up top every single time. And so what we see is that our main banks are not taking that into account. And when like Rosa Galvez has done incredible work on the climate aligned finance bill, and she basically, as part of that, tracked how the leadership of the banks is going in and out of the leadership of the oil companies. So there's massive conflicts of interest. This is not serving us in our finances. And so the work that Tim is doing is frankly not only essential to our financial stability, but I think it's essential to the stability of the country as a whole. we don't want our banking system to collapse. And right now, because our public narrative is driven by the fossil fuel company, most people simply don't know what they don't know. And so what you'll find is you'll come to conversations and they will be gaslighting you. And if you're a woman, they're going to think that's just fine. And I have just come to terms with that. And so what you have to do is just no more than them. You have to be polite and you have to be persistent. You just have to keep coming and coming and coming. And really, the aha moment of the Canadian Medical Association was actually with an engineer, Mike Gasowitz, who was at the time the vice president of MD Financial, which is the company that invests MD Financial, or the CMA's funds, or did at that moment. And he was on. I had spoken with all sorts of people lower in the organization. I wasn't getting anywhere. So I was like, look, I'm just going to lay in wait for the dudes who are on stage and wait till they get off. So I'm like standing there. I'm from the Northwest Territories, so nobody expects anything of somebody from the Northwest Territories. There is a rural bias in this country. And so there I am. They know I've submitted a motion around divestment. He gets off. I'm like, hi, I'm Courtney for the Northwest Territories. And he looks at me and he's like, full disclosure, we're supposed to have a meeting about you and your motion right now. Like in quote, like bracket problematic motion, right? He didn't say that, but that was clearly the look on his face. And so we went to the back of the auditorium and we sat there and I pulled up the Carbon Tracker website, which was the first good academic place where they had basically, I think that's actually where Bill McKibben got his numbers from. And it was associated with the London School of Economics. It was associated with the Grantham Environment Research Institute. And so we're sitting there at the back of the lecture hall, like the big auditorium. And I'm showing this to Mike, and I didn't know him at that point, but I noticed he had an engineering ring. I'm like, okay, so like this guy knows numbers. And what I love about engineers is there's also an accountability, right? It's not like they can just crunch numbers. Like they have to make sure bridges don't fall down. And so I showed him the carbon bubble stuff, and he looks, and it like I watch the penny drop. He like was like da 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 like chick from an NWT, and then he went like this, and he's like, "Are these guys legit? Are these guys legit?" And he said it 3 times, and then I pointed at the logo, and I was like, "Do you think the London School of Economics is legit?" And it was just like whoosh. We had a meeting with the other, he texted people, and we were talking to the head of MD Financial within about like 3 seconds. And from that point on, we were moving together. And so the Canadian Medical Association divested because it is in alignment with ethics, but also because there were smart people in charge who understood that there was a systemic risk to their investments. And that is kind of why you have to understand basically everything Tim has just said. And a great way to start is by doing it with your own finances, because at that point I'd already talked to Tim. I was like calling him as well for details, because they're going to have questions. Anyway, Tim has been amazing. It was like an incredible adventure.
I'll say it's gotten way easier, Courtney, that when we did that work before, yeah, I know, but I had to like cobble together to do the first fossil fuel free portfolio. We had to go through like sector by sector, and there were no products available. This wasn't really a big, sort of a market thing at all. And that my goodness, how far it's come. That now there are lots of products, like every major bank at least has a product, whether they're good or not, we can talk about. Whether the fees are appropriate or not, we can talk about, but at least the options are available now that weren't available back then. And that as well, but it's been really interesting because there was this huge movement where people seem to be really getting it. And then like during like just pre-COVID, I remember like early 2020, it was like the biggest issue and everyone was talking about divestment, and ESG was like a hot topic, and I was getting like all these interview requests and everything. And then now it's been really, really interesting, sort of a bit of a backlash in the media, where now there's kind of this like anti-woke piece, and it's been really interesting to see the narrative. But meanwhile, on the investment side, to your point, it's not fully priced in yet, and especially with the banks. But what I would say is, number one, like the insurance industry gets it. Like if you want to look at like who actually gets it in the financial industry, insurance totally gets it. The bond market is like a little bit behind them. It's starting to get it, but it's the stock market. The stock market doesn't get it at all. There are too many people who just completely dismiss it, who just like don't, they're just like, their worldview is such that they just don't care about it. They don't think about it. It's just like not part of that consideration at all. So it is scary. You know, I would say that it's been, on the one hand, it's encouraging to see the progress. Like when I think back to, you know, whatever it was 12 years ago, where, you know, how far the industry has come. But at the same time, based on the timeline and like what we know the urgency is, that they, you know, it really is taking its sweet time to price these things in.
I'm just going to jump in and say thank you to both of you. We've got the Q&A coming up. Both of you doing such impactful work. It is inspirational. Thank you. And I'm going to ask people, just because I'm on my phone and I'm not great with going back between the chat and the Q&A. If you want to load up the Q&A, that would be great. And we will go back to the chat first. And I'm going to slide up. I think Kent had one in here. And this was around, you know, the stuff, Tim, that you're talking about. Are students anywhere being taught this kind of information? We were talking about med school and engineering.
I mean, Courtney, you can speak on the med school side. Like, it sounds like that change in curriculum got implemented last October. Is that right?
Well, Miles and I work on this a lot together. We now have a mandate. So they've now agreed, and in fact, it's significant because they've more or less agreed to use planetary health as a lens for everything, which is really the only way it makes sense. Essentially, you want to be taking climate risk into account in everything you're doing. You want to be taking toxics into account. It's not a separate topic. It's an awareness. It's a way of looking at the world. Yeah. And so in all the curriculum surveys we've done, the students tend to lead the way. And so there's often, you know, a student group who's putting on optional lectures, and that's how it sort of starts. But in almost every case, like during the landscape analysis we did as we put together this roadmap, the number one gap was that senior leaders didn't know what they didn't know. And just anecdotally, speaking with people in, you know, economics at Oxford, like that was the case. The people teaching my class did not know what they didn't know. This was 144 people from 52 countries, like chosen specifically because they felt like they had what it take to go lead their country. And they graduated without knowing this. And to that school's credit, they listened, and this year the person in charge of that program is actually their climate leader. So, you know, things are changing, but it's really hard when you're briefing up through the hierarchy in whatever discipline you're in, because if you don't get a meeting with the most powerful person, things just don't change. But once you do, sometimes it can change like wildfire.
The whole thing. And my experience is that, you know, on the personal finance side, is that nobody learns personal finance. That even in business schools and MBAs and whatever, people have no idea, are never taught how to manage their own money and how to do things themselves. So I've been actually partnering with some of the sustainable business schools here in Canada, and to do a guest lecture. And then I invite the students to come into my classroom. I give them like a year for free so that they can like learn these practical skills, how to join a credit union, how to set up an emergency fund, how to start investing for the first time. And then obviously, you know, I try to sneak in the sustainability, you know, throughout those lessons. But it is shocking to me how many people in business and finance, let alone other faculties, you know, really have no idea, you know, how to manage their own personal finances.
Yeah, doctors aren't very well known for managing their own finances. But okay, so I'm going to go to what looks more like a statement, but I will read it and see if you have any feedback. And this is from Harsha. The financing of fossil fuels is one part of this, but we need to also look at how the cost of climate change is being built into our day-to-day costs, whether that is increasing property taxes or even basic costs of food items. This is largely because climate mitigation adaptation is underfunded due to short-term bias. Any comments on that? Looks like I think I got a thumbs up from Tim on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak. Dr. Howard mentioned earlier Kate Rayworth, and this idea of donut economics. And I think a lot of people are now starting to understand how important economics is. Little anecdote is when I did my undergrad in econ back in like 2002, nobody wanted to talk to me at a party. Like I'd go to a party and there'd be like young girls there and like, what do you study? And I'd be like, economics. And they'd be like, oh, you know. And then 2008 hit and the crash hit, and all of a sudden everyone was like, oh my goodness, like this really impacts our lives. Like, holy crap, I need to understand economics and what this means. And then now, my goodness, people are, you know, with inflation over the last few years, people didn't know what inflation was. Now we know how important that is. Tariffs, I'm getting all these questions about tariffs right now, right? So these things are so interconnected, they impact every piece of our life. When we talk about intersectionality of issues, right? To me, it's money and it's the economy that is that intersectionality that touches absolutely every piece of that. And climate change in the same way has this massive impact on every aspect of the economy. So again, we're really starting to see it with insurance, you know, the fires out west, flooding that, you know, entire parts of Florida are uninsurable now. So the insurance industry is going to get it absolutely. And then from there, I think it really is understanding these bigger questions about our economic system, Courtney, this notion of like, you know, the obsession with growth and short-term bias versus this notion of like, you know, sort of like a long-term economy based on well-being. You know, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I'm writing a book right now, and this is basically what my book is about. I think that we need to transition to a way of being that is explicitly focused on delivering long-term well-being for all. And that actually starts with each one of us defining what our goals are. Because when you think about it, we're right now, I've led and designed several big studies in my life. You're always looking for what's your primary outcome, right? Like, what are you going to measure? And it matters what you decide to measure. And at some point, and there's like interesting philosophical sort of antecedents to this, where everyone's always agreed that well-being and happiness is the most important thing. But then a couple hundred years ago, and Eric Beinhocker was one of my professors. He was my sort of summer project advisor. They just didn't have the math or the calculators to calculate what well-being was. So they just up and decided, and he called it like armchair economics, to equate well-being with money. And so that happened, and those equations are still running our lives, and we haven't re-examined that assumption. But the reality is that money doesn't equate with well-being. And if we are trying to optimize our personal lives for that, or if we are trying to optimize our national policy for that, we're going to make super inefficient investments. And the kicker right now is that those investments are undermining the foundation of all well-being, which is our ecological platform. And so, you know, really what I love about it is it allows you to build your life in a no regrets way. Like, you look at it, okay, like, what's my capacity? You can do comprehensive wealth management at the personal level. Like, what is my ecological wealth? What is my human capacity? What are my social connections? What is my built environment? And you can, what is my financial capital? It's important. And you can move that all the way up to comprehensive wealth accounting at the national level. It all works. And I really think it's both the narrative and the method of measurement and policy evaluation that we need to be moving towards, both as president or CEO or prime minister of me and at the national level. And actually, we've done some of that work. But we haven't made the ultimate transition as some other countries like New Zealand have. And I think it's time to start looking into that.
Awesome. A few more questions to get through here from Sean. Any recommendations on green digital robo-advisors for sustainable investing like Questrade or Wealthsimple?
Yeah, I can speak to this. This is an easy one. So I've looked at all the robo-advisors. I would put Wealthsimple at the top of my list, and specifically from a carbon perspective. It's not perfect. I don't want to get too deep into it, but it's probably the best of those lot. All I would say, Sean, is that you can probably do better. That now we do have what are called these all-in-one ETFs that do the same thing as a robo-advisor. So, I do have a list of ETFs on my website. It's goodinvesting.com, free resources, and I have these all in one. But rather than doing like the Wealthsimple Robo Advisor, you can use Wealthsimple Trade, or you can use Questrade and their digital platform to buy. We now have like a balanced ETF, GBAL, which is the iShares ESG Balanced ETF portfolio, which is completely fossil fuel free, such that it's all the robo advisors, I would say, are kind of almost made obsolete by these all-in-one ETFs. So if you had to go with the robo advisor, I'd say Wealthsimple is the best, but I'd actually rather you look at these all-in-one ETFs as a great starting point for investing.
All right. And from Linda, what can we do to move the major banks to change their investments? For example, she had an RSP with one of the big banks years ago and had them go through all their investment options for her that were more sustainable, and they realized they really had no option for her. So if we all did that, could we help move the sector?
So I'll go first here, Courtney. I'd love your opinion on this, but I'm done trying to move the big banks. I'm done. I don't think they care. I don't think they're looking. I think they pay lip service at most and look at it as a way to rip people off. I don't think they share my values, right, on these issues at all. So I'm done trying to convince them. So like bluntly, Linda, I would say like set up a free consultation with me and let's move you out of RBC. That like I'm at the point where really it's I've had clients try to work within these systems and try to move them and try to push them. TD was like, for a long time we were like, oh, TD, they're really going to go green, they're really going to do this stuff. Nope, new CEO, completely shifted away. They actually closed their ETF, so they launched sustainable investment funds, and then they didn't know how to sell them, so they weren't doing well, so they just closed them a couple months ago. So I'm really done trying to work within the banks and trying to push that system. To me, it's like there are much better options for you. And I would just say that your energy is better spent finding a new place for your money rather than trying to move that behemoth of a system.
Before Courtney jumps in, I'm just going to point out, I think we've got a few minutes left. Courtney, Tim, are you able to stay an extra couple minutes so we get to all the questions? Yeah. Okay. Courtney, do you have anything to add there?
I think as health science oriented humans, we're really focused on evidence. And I think we need to get way better at analyzing power. So I don't think they're going to shift until the power shifts. Like when you look at it, essentially, as we've looked at, Canada has a lot of reasons to transition to a different way of doing things. But when you look at who is like, there have been a couple of analyses that have showed that basically federal decision makers are meeting with fossil fuel reps about 5 times as often as they're meeting with environmental NGOs. And those are the official records. Those are official lobbying records. That's not looking at like texts to staffers, phone calls to staffers, right? Like those are only the ones where you like show up, and I've done this before, and you like sign a book and like, so you can imagine what the more informal connections are. And we have evidence from doctors and prescription habits that when doctors meet with pharmaceutical reps, they don't think they change their prescription habits. But do you think they would keep sending the pharmaceutical reps to the doctor's offices if there wasn't a financial payback? Of course they do. Like they're running the numbers on that. And it every time those numbers show up in literature, it shows that it does change our prescription habits. So basically right now we have our decision makers being systematically lobbied by a billion-dollar industry. And, we're regulated by emotion far more than we think we are. Oh, it's Joe. I know Joe. Joe has memorized the names of my children. Oh, he asks about Johnny. Yeah, doing great. Like this is how humans work. And the problem is that we all think we're too smart to be influenced by that. We need to get way better at that. Like when I look at where I'm the chair of the Global Climate and Health Alliance, which is essentially an advocacy and policy shop. If I wanted to get money for research, I could get money for that. But I do almost all of my work as a volunteer because no one is willing to pay physicians for influence work. You look at what is actually required to move the ball, it's influence work. It's communications. So in a sense, we have to kind of get over ourselves, look at and learn from what's working for the other side and adopt some of those practices. And so, ego plays a role, and it's not always the other side. That's always at blame. And so this is about power. We need to get good at analyzing it, and we need to invest far more resources and training in building it.
Thank you. So anyone who needs to jump off, please do so. The one other thing I didn't ask you, Yusra, is are we going to run out of time in a minute, or are we going to be able to keep talking? I'm going to try to keep talking. Okay, let's see what happens.
I don't think we'll run out of time for it.
Okay. So next question from Tylene. I hope she's still here. Are all credit unions a better choice? What about credit unions in Alberta, such as Service?
Yeah, I can speak to this one. Yes, all credit unions are better just by virtue of how the governance structure. That banks are for-profit companies that are publicly traded. They solely exist to maximize returns to shareholders. Okay, so as a customer, you are a source of, profit for them to get turned into dividends for shareholders. That is their entire MO. Credit unions are co-ops. They're co-ops. They're cooperatives, right? So it's their job, their mandate is to increase services to members. So just from a governance standpoint, credit unions are way better. And then when you look at their loan portfolios, the issue is that, that banks take our deposits and they use a multiplier effect and they turn that into loans. This is how banks get the money to make these loans. And when we look at the loan portfolio of banks, we know it's fossil fuels, we know it's military companies, we know it's XYZ large, multinational companies, you name it. Whereas with credit unions, their loan portfolio is primarily made up of mortgages and small business loans within your community. Now, in Alberta, there is such a big oil and gas sector that, their loan portfolio is going to have more sort of, oil and gas service providers and small business owners and contractors. But, to me, that's a very, very different thing than loaning money to the company that is doing the extraction, that is building the pipeline, that is kind of that sort of multinational. So credit unions by default are more local, are more ethical, and exist to serve us, the members, rather than their investors. And I just want to point out, there's been a whole thing around our food system lately, and Loblaws and boycotting Loblaws, and these oligopolies where a lot of us don't have a lot of choices about grocery stores. And my dream is imagine if we had all these local co-op grocery stores where we could support our local farmers and have an alternative to these big box grocery stores. With banks, we have that option. We have credit unions. We have this amazing alternative that's just as good, right? It's just a lot of us don't know about it. A lot of us have never heard of it. They don't spend enough money on marketing and advertising. So yes, by default, even in Alberta, credit unions are a better choice as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, thanks. And Courtney, it says that you were typing an answer there to Wendy. Or do you want to speak to it? Yeah.
I'll speak to it just because.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So Wendy, it's really helpful to find your people. And so you're on this webinar, so I feel like you probably have. And it's also really helpful to get training. We designed the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment Advocacy and Mobilization Program to include all of the things we wished we had known when we started. And it's actually accredited by both medical colleges. I don't know if I don't think it's accredited for nurses, but there's no reason why we couldn't work on something that does that, because the reality, these are skill sets, and if you don't get taught, it's terrifying and you're ineffective, and you gradually get more effective, but there's a lot less payoff. And so just accelerate that learning curve, go find your people, get some training, because we don't get taught how to campaign. And once you're working with good campaigners, you actually start to win stuff. So, we won the divestment campaign. The Canadian Medical Association is a over $2 billion NGO. It's the biggest NGO in Canada. So this is a giant deal. They now have a team working on this, that they are being active investors. They're showing up at shareholder meetings. Their lead person actually came to COP. so was at COP representing the Canadian Medical Association and the financial sort of circles and conversations. They're teaching other health professional organizations how to do this. CAPE, as you know, we were key to the Canadian coal power phase out conversation. We had a big influence on the food guide. That it takes training. And I genuinely am astonished that we don't more often go get that training. The Blavatnik School of Government, all they do all day for their whole lives is figure out how to do this stuff. Some of the smartest people in the world. There are buildings for this on every campus across Canada. And if we don't go talk to them, that is on us. Honestly, if I need a consult from a neurosurgeon, I call a neurosurgeon. If I need a consult from a political scientist, I go call a political scientist. And I don't think it's okay at this moment in time for us to not know what we don't know about what they're doing in that building across campus, because all those people do all day is talk about power, think about power, figure out how to better influence power. We need to talk to them.
Okay, Yusra, I'm going to ask you in a minute to close up the shop, but there's one last question about Investors Group, green options. Tim, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, Ken, and I saw your question before about some people don't feel they're like wealthy enough to work with an advisor. So, okay, first of all, Investors Group, the green options, I don't love them, but the reason I really hate them is, again, because of fees. That it's just, they're a ripoff. Like the fees on them are absurdly high. Investors Group is some of the highest fees in the country. So, really, I can speak about it from a sustainability perspective. Again, it's going to depend where you are on that spectrum. They go sort of a little bit, they don't go quite as far enough for me, but it'll depend where you are on that spectrum. But there's no question that there are cheaper options for you. The Daryl, who I'm doing the webinar with on Tuesday next week, the minimum investment there is 100K. If you've got less than 100K, no problem. That's where I've got my classroom, where I teach people to use one of those robo-advisors. So someone mentioned like Wealthsimple, or those robo-advisors, or those all-in-one ETFs. Like literally, you can get a more sustainable option than that Investors Group mutual fund that's more sustainable, and it's literally 90% off the fees. That instead of paying I think it's about 2.4% is their fees, we can get it down to 0.24% per year. Literally 90% off, just by learning a little bit about what an ETF versus a mutual fund is and learning how to purchase that. So this is really the path that I have for folks. If you've got sort of less than 100K, then like just learn the basics. It doesn't take the 8 hours that it took Courtney to do it. Like we can do it now. It's like a couple hours, I would say, of learning about this stuff to get you set up. Really important basic knowledge to like learn how to do that. And then if you decide you're like, Tim, I don't want to do this, I want to, pay someone to do it for me, then that's when, starting at 100K, I've got a great option where you can pool your money with David Suzuki Foundation and Greenpeace Canada and actually have a full service advisor do it for you. So, that would be my suggestion there. And again, it's just important. I want people to understand that, there are a lot of these products that are labeled as sustainable. Those are all going to be better than the standard one. So going from whatever Investors Group normal fund to their sustainable fund, like, yes, absolutely a step in the right direction. But since you're asking me my opinion, I do think that we can do better, not only from an ethical perspective, but definitely from a fees-based perspective, which, over a 30, 40-year horizon, like I don't want to get into the sort of the thing about management fees, but it really, that's probably like one of the number one factors when it comes to, how much money you're going to have in retirement and what your actual rate of return is, does come down to those fees that you're paying. So, Ken would really just say, you can do better.
All right, thank you. That brings us to the end. No more questions. But of course, if anyone has any, feel free to send them over to me via email or in our closing email. If Dr. Courtney and Tim are okay with it, I can plug their emails as well. Great. So thank you so much for coming today to our webinar. We know we went a little bit over, but thank you for sticking around for these extra 8 minutes. We hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And as always, we're going to post this recording online and send over the slides that we had presented and also a feedback form. So if you have any thoughts or